proof that Islam is the truth. And today we're talking about the preservation of the Quran. And I just wanted to read an ayah from the Quran. Verily, we have revealed the dhikr, the reminder, which is one of the words for the Quran. And verily upon us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, upon us is the preservation of it. This is a promise in the Quran that Allah will preserve the Quran. And the reality of the preservation of the Quran is without doubt one of the miraculous aspects of the Quran and one of the proofs and the evidences that it is from Allah. In fact, you will find that nearly every type of book and scripture and writing through time goes through many alterations and distortions and corruptions. Now, this may not be the case so much today with the invention of the printing press, but of course in ancient times when books were largely transcribed by scribes, then there was a lot of opportunity for corruptions and distortions and additions and deletions to take place. Yet throughout the 1,400 years of Islamic history, the Quran has remained the same. In fact, it is one of the most remarkable things that you could take a copy of the Quran today. You could take a copy of the Quran today. So for example, if we took this Quran here, and we looked at the Arabic, so this is of course an English Arabic Quran, but if you looked at the Quran today, and you took this Quran and you compare it with a Quran in Saudi Arabia, and you compare it with a Quran in Morocco, and you compare it with a Quran in China, and you compared it with a Quran in Siberia, and even if you went back in history 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, 1,200 years, in fact, the most ancient manuscripts that we have of the Quran date to a time that is almost contemporaneous to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. It means we have manuscripts of the Quran dating back all the way back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And the amazing thing is that if you examined these manuscripts, you would find that the actual words of the Quran are exactly the same. Okay, the style of writing may be different. The use of certain diacritical marks may be different. But the actual words remain exactly the same. This is a fact. Actually, this is one of the greatest arguments against those people who claim. There are some people who are trying to claim that the Quran has evolved, it's an evolved text. They're trying to make the same claims about the Quran that have been discovered about the Bible. But no one or very few people take these claims really seriously. And part of the reason is that the sheer weight of evidence against such a claim is there. Because we have these texts of the Quran, and we have different manuscripts in places like, for example, Tashkent, we have manuscripts in Cairo, we have manuscripts in Yemen, we have very, very ancient manuscripts that date really to the time, very close to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Let's go very briefly through the history of the written preservation of the Quran. Now, of course, during the lifetime of Rasulullah ﷺ, the Quran was never actually collected as one book. And the reason for that, of course, is that as long as the Prophet ﷺ was alive, it was still possible that some more verses of the Quran would be revealed. However, the Prophet ﷺ, he used to recite the Quran from beginning to end every Ramadan. And in the Ramadan before he died, the Prophet ﷺ recited the Quran twice. And the angel Gabriel, Jibreel, used to come and go through the Quran with the Prophet ﷺ in the month of Ramadan. So the Quran was known from Surah Al-Fatiha to Surah An-Nas, it was known by the people who used to memorize the Quran, and what was known as the Quran was understood, but it was never written down as what is called a mushaf. They wrote down the Quran in various pieces and fragments, but it was never written down as one book. However, after the Prophet ﷺ died, there were what was called the wars of Ridda. These are the wars of apostasy, when many people began to apostatize and leave the religion of Islam. And there were some wars against those people. And in those wars, many of those people who had memorized the entire Quran, who were known as the Huffaz, the memorizers or the preservers, from Hafiz, which means to preserve in Arabic. These people had preserved and memorized the entire Quran in their memory. We will get back to that at a later stage about the oral transmission and memorization of the Quran. But now we're talking about the written preservation of the Quran. So these people, many of them were killed in battle. So it was said to Abu Bakr, who was the ruler of the Muslims, the first caliph or the first ruler of the Muslims. Some people said to him, why don't you write down the Quran to make sure that we don't suffer from what the people suffered from who came before us, meaning the Jews and Christians, from their distortions and the corruptions in their text. Because we're afraid that if the Huffaz are killed in great numbers, then maybe the preservation of the Quran will not be maintained. So anyway, there was some dispute about this, because some of them said, well, how can we do something that the Prophet ﷺ never did? But they agreed, and Umar and Abu Bakr, having discussed it with each other, they agreed, and the companions had agreed that this was a good idea. So what they did is they got someone called Zayd ibn Thabit. They got him to organize this collection of the Quran, and with the agreement of those people who were the Huffaz, who were still living, they agreed to collect the Quran and to write it as one mushaf from the beginning to the end. And they got a unanimous decision about that. In fact, they got an agreement on every single ayah. Two people, a minimum of two people had to agree. Every single ayah of the Quran, they had to agree that this was the right ayah and it was in the right place also. So this was the first mushaf. And it stayed with Abu Bakr, and then when Abu Bakr died, it was given to Umar. And when Umar died, he gave it to his daughter, Hafsa. Hafsa was also one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, after the death of Umar, the Islam had spread over many, many different lands. Islam had entered into Persia, it had entered into Egypt, and there were so many people becoming Muslim. Now, some of the people began to argue with each other about the reading of the Quran, because the Prophet ﷺ, and it's very important, he had allowed the Quran to be read in 7 different dialects. So there were 7 different dialects. They were all considered to be the Quran, and the Prophet allowed the reading of the Quran in those 7 different dialects. However, some of the people who read it in one dialect began to argue with those who read it in another dialect, and they were saying, our reading is the right reading and your reading is the wrong reading, and vice versa. And they nearly came to blows over this issue. So one of the generals came to Uthman ibn Affan and said, look, this is a problem. Let us unite the people under one reading, and this way we will avoid dissension and controversy. So Uthman, he said, okay, this is a good idea. What we will do is we will unite the people under the reading of the Qurayshi dialect. The Qurayshi dialect was the dialect that the Prophet ﷺ, he used to use the most often. Okay, this was the dialect the Prophet ﷺ himself used to use. So once again, he ordered a compilation of the Quran. And who did he get? The same Zayd ibn Thabit. They got the same Zayd ibn Thabit to make a compilation of the Quran. And once again, he got a total agreement For each ayah, a minimum of 2 people had to agree about this ayah, that it was correct and that its placement in the Quran was correct. And once again, they made a compilation of the text of the Quran. Then they compared this new compilation with the compilation that had been made by Abu Bakr. And they found that the two corresponded exactly. They were both corresponding exactly one with the other. So then Uthman ordered that every copy that people had made and every writing that people had made of the Quran should be destroyed. And the way that they destroyed it was by burning it. Okay? This is considered to be a clean and pure way to destroy the text of the Quran. It's not like maybe in Western culture these days, when they want to get rid of books, they burn the books as a type of protest. No, this was considered to be a clean way to dispose of the Quran. So every Quran they had was either washed, as the Mus'haf that was given to from Abu Bakr and Umar to Hafsa, it was actually washed clean. And every type of copy of the Quran was destroyed except this, what is called the Imam manuscript. That was the Imam manuscript compiled by Uthman under the supervision of Zayd ibn Thabit. And from that, 7 copies or maybe 9 copies were made. So from that Imam manuscript, 7 or 9 copies were made. And these copies were distributed all over the Muslim world at the time. And every Quran therefore had to be an exact replica, an exact copy of those Qurans. So we still have, according to many experts in the field, we still have 2 or 3 of those original manuscripts existing that was compiled in the time of Uthman ibn Affan, which is only some 20 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And as I said, you can go anywhere in the world today and you can take a copy of the Quran and you can compare it with Qurans anywhere, and you can go back in history 300, 400, 500 years, and you can compare those Qurans then with the Qurans that we have today, and you will not find they are different, not by a word, not by a letter. So this is a fact. This is a fact, and this is really an astounding miracle of the Quran, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said that verily we have revealed the dhikr, the reminder, and upon us is the preservation of it. So this is the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His infinite wisdom has preserved the Quran. What is important here for the rest of our discussions in the series to come is, of course, that when we are referring to the Quran, we are referring to a document that is verified and certified to be authentic. It is something that we do not differ about. All the different Muslim sects, all of us, we agree upon one single text of the Quran. And we have agreed upon one single text of the Quran for 1,400 years. So this is a book that is preserved. This is a book that is authentic. This is a book that we can trust in and we can believe in. And this is, inshallah, what we will be discussing later in future programs. The next one is the oral preservation of the Quran. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon